Escucha bien, ¿verdad? Un placer. Bueno, mi nombre es Carlos Codas, para quienes no me conozcan. Lidero la práctica de financiamiento en general de Ferrere. Está Pamela Lezcano, que lidera la práctica bursátil, y Guillermo, Jover, quien lidera la práctica de compliance. Ferrere es una firma de abogados regional. Tenemos oficinas en Uruguay, Bolivia, también en Paraguay, y prestamos servicios en todas las ramas del derecho, menos el derecho penal. La idea es ayudar en general a inversionistas y a productos de todo tipo a prosperar en Paraguay. Y bueno, hoy nos une un tema muy relevante, muy actual, y sobre el cual creo que en el mercado en general hay desconocimiento, me incluyo, lógicamente, pues se aplica una ley extranjera, ¿verdad? Una ley reciente también, relativamente reciente, que hace alusión y que tiene relación con una sanción aplicada por el gobierno norteamericano en virtud de lo que se denomina la ley Magnitsky, ¿verdad? Dictaron básicamente una orden ejecutiva, que es algo como similar a un decreto, y en virtud de eso declararon como significativamente corruptos a figuras públicas aquí en Paraguay y a determinadas empresas, y eso tiene ciertos efectos, sobre todo en función con el sistema financiero norteamericano y con personas físicas y jurídicas con nacionalidad norteamericana o constituidas en Estados Unidos. Y antes de cederle la palabra a Guille, me gustaría comentar que generalmente las leyes en Estados Unidos, adelante por favor, generalmente las leyes en Estados Unidos llevan el nombre de legisladores y demás, pero este es un caso, no diría excepcional, hay otras, pero es un caso atípico. ¿Por qué se llama ley Magnitsky? Básicamente por una persona rusa, Sergei Magnitsky, que trabajaba en Estados Unidos en un fondo occidental, uno de los fondos occidentales más grandes de inversión en Rusia, Hermitage Capital. Era un fondo, un magnate norteamericano, creo que Bill Brodsky, creo que, si mal no recuerdo era el nombre, y que tenía muy buena relación en general con el gobierno norteamericano, ruso, y en un momento dado, allá por el 2008, las relaciones ya no eran tan buenas. Se le expulsa a esta persona de Rusia y queda Sergei Magnitsky a hacer una especie de auditoría en algunas transacciones que se hicieron con el fondo y no necesariamente con entidades relacionadas a Rusia, pero con o que habrían estado involucrados ciertos funcionarios públicos rusos. Siempre hablo del supuesto, ¿verdad? Policías, banqueros, funcionarios de Hacienda y funcionarios de muy alto nivel. Magnitsky era un abogado muy joven, tenía 37 años, y descubrió un supuesto fraude de 230 millones de dólares con propiedades de este fondo en el que habrían estado involucrados estos funcionarios rusos. Entonces en el 2008, allá por creo que mediados o finales del 2008, se decreta en Rusia un fraude fiscal, supuesto fraude fiscal de este fondo, y se le encarcela a Magnitsky. Y durante su encarcelamiento supuestamente se producen torturas a su persona. Y en Rusia también, digo supuestamente, porque no soy experto en Rusia, todo esto es fruto de una investigación. Supuestamente el plazo máximo de prisión preventiva, Magnitsky estaba en prisión preventiva desde un año, 7 días antes de que cese la prisión preventiva, fallece Magnitsky, en situaciones no del todo claras. Entonces esto fue en el 2009, el fallecimiento fue en el 2009 y generó una controversia internacional muy importante, no solamente en el gobierno norteamericano, sino con países occidentales en general, que acusaron a Rusia de violaciones de derechos humanos. Fruto de eso, de ese incidente, se genera una movida política también en Estados Unidos, y en el 2012 se aprueba la ley Magnitsky, que en principio tenía como, y probablemente los colegas nos van a explicar mucho mejor, pero tenía como efecto o alcance solamente a acciones o violaciones de derechos humanos de funcionarios rusos. Y en el 2016 eso se extiende el alcance de esa ley y se hace global. Es decir, la ley norteamericana alcanza en general a violaciones de derechos humanos, se llama ley de responsabilidad en derechos humanos, básicamente es accountability, que es como una rendición de cuentas en materia de derechos humanos, y alcanza violaciones en derechos humanos, torturas, ejecuciones extrajudiciales, pero también a actos de corrupción significativa que puedan socavar democracias, instituciones y buena gobernabilidad, porque eso hace o termina fomentando también las violaciones de derechos humanos. Y es ahí donde nos encontramos en esta declaración, en base a esa ley que tiene esa esa secuencia histórica y es básicamente lo que vamos a hablar, porque nuevamente lo que nos reúne hoy es la incertidumbre en cuanto a su alcance, en cuanto a su aplicación y en base a la casuística, ¿verdad? Así que bueno, nuevamente le cedo la palabra a Guille, quien va a presentarnos. Olvida lo importante también, son dos panelistas de primer nivel. Dejo que Guille los presente y un estudio también muy prestigioso que está a nivel global.
Gracias, Carly. Bienvenidos a todos a Ferrere. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Como mencionó Carly, este tema es un tema que ha cobrado muchísima visibilidad acá en Paraguay recientemente, con justa razón, porque son las primeras sanciones de su tipo a ser aplicadas en Paraguay en un momento político sensible, también a un grupo económico que tiene mucha importancia y mucho peso en nuestro sistema económico, indudablemente. Entonces nos pareció propicia la ocasión para hablar un poco de este tema, tratar de dilucidar un poco cuál es el alcance de las sanciones que fueron impuestas por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos. Les quiero dar un poquitito la estructura de la charla para que tengan en cuenta y puedan ayudarnos a seguir. Sí, voy a preguntar. La estructura de la charla vamos a hablar un poco, le vamos a preguntar a nuestros dos panelistas que, como mencionó Carly, son de una firma muy prestigiosa a nivel global, de la firma Allen & Overy. Es una de las firmas más prestigiosas en todo el mundo, tiene oficinas en todo el mundo. Hoy nos van a acompañar Kenneth Rivlin, que es socio de Allen & Overy en la oficina de Nueva York, y ahí el asociado Nick Ognibene, que está también en la oficina de Nueva York y en la oficina de Boston. Ambos son expertos en sanciones económicas. Ambos son expertos en temas de comercio exterior y derecho regulatorio en la materia de comercio exterior. Así que nos parecieron dos personas que nos pueden ayudar un poco a desentrañar los varios aspectos de estas sanciones, ¿no? Entonces, ¿de qué vamos a hablar hoy? Vamos a hablar de las sanciones en sí, qué son, qué dicen, qué implican, cuál es su alcance con respecto a las personas sancionadas. O sea, sabemos las personas individuales y las empresas que están sancionadas, pero también están sancionadas las empresas en las cuales las personas sancionadas tienen 50% o más de participación accionaria. Entonces vamos a tratar de entender exactamente qué significa eso, cómo podemos saber nosotros cuál es una empresa sancionada y cuál no. Vamos a preguntar también el alcance de las sanciones a familiares y asociados de las personas sancionadas. Vamos a preguntarle si la venta de acciones o la transferencia de acciones a familiares o asociados es válida. Y cómo podemos saber nosotros si estamos lidiando con una transferencia que hace que las empresas ya no estén sancionadas o ya no caigan dentro del alcance de las sanciones. Vamos a hablar también del efecto de las sanciones en terceros, o sea, en ustedes, en las empresas que ustedes representan, para entender un poco qué responsabilidades y qué cambios tienen que hacer las empresas acá, qué acciones deben tomar, qué medidas convienen implementar. Para entender también cómo manejarnos nosotros, ¿no? Vamos a preguntar también qué tipo de transacciones son las que están alcanzadas. Había muchas preguntas con respecto al uso del dólar, por ejemplo. Vamos a tratar de entender qué transacciones o qué tipo de negocios son los que gatillan, digamos, el accionar de estas sanciones y de las posibles consecuencias de incumplimiento, ¿no? Y justamente vamos a terminar con la pregunta de cuáles son los riesgos para las empresas, para los terceros, en caso de que caigan o incurran en un incumplimiento de estas sanciones, ¿no? Bueno, un tema administrativo. Vamos a hacer la conversación con Ken y con Nick en inglés. Así que creo que ya se distribuyeron los aparatitos de traducción. Le tenemos a José y a Ana ahí atrás en la cabina que van a estar haciendo la interpretación en simultáneo. Así que para los que prefieran escuchar la conversación en castellano, les pido que se pongan los auriculares en este momento. Pame, no sé si querés.
Sí, un temita también administrativo. Si es que alguien tiene alguna consulta que quiera hacer, voy a agradecer si es que me pueden mandar por correo a lezcano@ferrer.com. Entonces, si es que hay tiempo, nosotros vamos a poder responder todas sus preguntas al final. O si no, bueno, vamos a estar en contacto para poder responder todas las preguntas que ustedes tengan. Y también de repente, si es que hay una pregunta que ya se respondió durante la charla, entonces esas vamos a pasar, ¿verdad? Entonces, les digo otra vez, plezcano@ferrer.com.
Gracias, Pame. Bueno, no sé si ya tenemos conexión. Nick, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Good morning, Nick. Ken, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Sorry for the delay in getting on.
No problem. Ken, Nick, thank you so much for being with us this morning. We are very grateful for your participation in this small seminar. We are here with representatives from major local financial institutions, insurance companies, and other companies in Paraguay. As you may imagine, the sanctions that were imposed by OFAC recently have caused quite a stir here in Paraguay and have raised a lot of questions with respect to the scope, with respect to the risks that are involved. So we wanted to share with you some of these questions that we have, and hopefully you can give us some answers and shed some light on these issues. Before we do that, I would love I made a brief introduction of both of you before we started in Spanish, but I would love it if you could introduce yourselves briefly, just so our audience here can get a little bit more familiar with you.
Absolutely. Nick, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks, Ken. My name is Nick Ognibene. I am an associate with the Sanctions and International Trade and Regulatory team at Allen & Overy. I'm based in our Boston office, having previously worked in New York and London. And I work closely with Ken and some other members of our team on a wide range of sanctions and other international trade and regulatory issues under US and other international law. Global Magnitsky sanctions are a key part of those, as well as the sanctions recently targeting Russia, Venezuela, and other jurisdictions around the world.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And I'm Ken Rivlin. Sorry for the moving back and forth, but I'm holding my phone. So I run the international trade practice at A&O. I've been here for 22 years. I joined from Cravath before that. We spend a lot of time on these kinds of issues, but never in Paraguay. So Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Russia have all been, among others, kind of key concerns. We've dealt with these issues many times in other jurisdictions. And so we understand how concerning these can be and how broad the impacts can be, how badly written the rules are, which leave you open to a lot of interpretation and question and doubt. We understand the fear of enforcement, which is significant, and the difficulties that these kinds of sanctions can pose. So we have seen these kinds of questions from every angle. We understand that, you probably don't want to be sitting in the room talking about these issues now, but we are happy to help you or explain to you this in any way that we can. And we appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you both. And again, welcome. So let's get right into it. Ken, Nick, could you explain to us a little bit what these sanctions are, what they say, and what entities are actually covered by the sanctions and designated as sanctioned or blocked entities or persons? So we know there's 2 individuals and there's a few companies belonging to one of those individuals, but there's also a third category of sanctioned companies, which are those in which one of those sanctioned individuals has 50% or more of the shares or control of the companies. So what exactly does that mean, and how can we know who the sanctioned companies are in that third category?
Okay, so just to review, and I think that you guys have these basics. The main targets are Horacio Cortez, Hugo Velasquez, and then the 4 entities that are owned or controlled by Cortez. So. And those are Tobaccos Bebidas, Dominicana Acquisition, and Frigorifico Shahija. And apologies for my absolutely terrible Spanish.
That last one's Guarani, by the way. Even harder.
I mean, honestly, I hate to admit this, but I studied Spanish at university, so I won't tell you where I went because that's just an embarrassment. Anyway, the key concept out of here, which may be new to many of you, is the so-called 50% rule. And the 50% rule that OFAC imposes in many, but not all of its sanctions programs, are that any entity that's 50% or more owned or controlled by a sanctions target is also a sanctions target as a matter of law. So, OFAC doesn't always go through the trouble of identifying every one of those entities. It tells the regulated community, if there is an SDN, a specially designated national, or some other sanctions target that owns or controls, it's your obligation to confirm whether the entity you're dealing with is owned or controlled by that person. So there's no magic to this. This goes to due diligence and confirmation of who or what you're dealing with and who owns it and how much they own it. So we've seen this. I mean, most recently, this was a significant issue in the Russian sanctions, where there were hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of entities that were owned by Russian oligarchs, 50% or more, who many of whom then went to sell a portion of their shares or all of it to relatives or friends or other third parties in order to reduce their ownership to below 50%. And doing that led to the underlying entity no longer being sanctioned. So you're likely to see those kinds of actions here. And they're the kinds of transactions around these sanctions that you may be participating in or need to diligence in order to assess your own risk. Nick, is there anything you'd like to add at that point?
Not other than just to note that that at this point, just very simply, Cartes and Velasquez are sanctioned, as are those four entities, and as Guillermo and Ken noted, any entity that is owned 50% or more, directly or indirectly, going down the ownership chain by one or more of these people or those four entities. And one other point to note is that an entity that's owned 50% or more by one of these blocked persons, if it becomes owned less than 50% by one of these blocked persons, it would not, as a matter of law, be sanctioned anymore, although there are some issues about confirming that and whether OFAC would understand that that has happened. However, the four specifically listed ones, they're sanctioned even if Cartes were to divest himself of them. The fact that they were named specifically means they're on the list now. Doesn't matter what happens with their ownership. They're sanctioned unless and until they are actually removed from the list themselves.
Right. And so what that means for you is that if you have any dealings with any of those four entities, directly or indirectly, as a supplier, as some party in a transaction, etc., first, no U.S. persons can be involved at all. And that goes from the chauffeur driver up to the lawyer to the business person negotiating the deal or someone in a factory providing products, and any U.S. person whatsoever. And that includes U.S. green card holders, et cetera. It also includes any non-American while in the U.S. So if you happen to be in the Miami airport and negotiating a deal or talking to them, that would technically, depending on the nature of the activity itself, also be a violation. Okay, but then there's also this element of what are called secondary sanctions. So if only non-US persons are involved, but the transaction with, let's say, Tobaccos somehow involves significant or material support or dealings with them, any kind of significant transaction on that that would benefit Tobaccos, then you as a non-US person could find yourself subject to secondary sanctions on the basis that you were dealing with them. Now, secondary sanctions are imposed less frequently. The activities would need to be fairly significant, but there is a risk there. And it's a kind of risk that you really probably do not want to be taking. And each one of those kinds of dealings, once you're in the position where you're actually dealing with them, then you need to really be careful to look at the nature of those activities to ensure you're not taking any undue exposure. And last thing I'd add on that, I'm sorry, one last point I'd add to that.
Sure.
To the extent that you have any U.S. financing, a bank, investors, et cetera, they could themselves have liability if you were to be dealing with them as well, by indirectly facilitating those activities. I'll stop there.
So Ken, I want to delve deeper into these third-party implications for who can act or deal with sanctioned entities in a minute. But before we get off the sanctioned persons part of the conversation, I just wanted to understand, you both mentioned that companies with 50%, where Cartes or another designated person have 50% or more ownership are also considered to be sanctioned targets. What does ownership mean? So is it just holding the shares? Is it indirect control through other people? What exactly does it mean to own one of these entities in the purview of the OFAC rules?
Okay, well, it's the OFAC rules are written by non-business people. So it's really the general lay person, average person's view of ownership. So it's, do you have equity and control either directly or indirectly? So if you set up a subsidiary and then that subsidiary owns the entity, then you'd still have ownership. If you do this through a partnership, the partnership would be an owner, and then depending on the nature and structure of the partnership, you and the other partners in the partnership could also be an owner. So it casts a very wide net on ownership, and the only way through that, and which we spend a lot of time doing, is evaluating either existing or contemplated ownership structures, and then assessing whether that structure would constitute ownership or control for purposes of the sanctions.
Perfect. We would like to know also, are family members of sanctioned persons or directors or employees of sanctioned companies also covered by these sanctions?
No, but you have to be very cautious. So if these persons are acting on behalf of a sanctioned party, then that itself can be an issue. So, we saw this a lot in the Russian context. One of the oligarchs they were all men. So they'd ask his wife or children or brother to take over control. And, OFAC was spending a lot of time investigating these circumstances, and where they found that a brother or a relative was involved, and sometimes they try to sanction that person, or they would pursue in other ways. So you need to be caution. And the caution there is that those persons acting on the behalf, those relatives, could themselves become subject to sanctions. And then there's also, some question about whether directors or employees could also become sanctioned. So sometimes the directors or the employees would take on more of a control role, which you could see happening in order to continue operating. There's risk that they themselves could become sanctioned again if they're seen to be acting on behalf of the SDN. So the key in all this is to really, to the extent possible, try to segregate your dealings so that the sanctioned target, the SDN, in this case, either of those four companies or Velasquez or Cartes, are clearly, completely ring-fenced from the entities that you're dealing with.
Thank you, Kenneth. Well, this question has a relation with the last one. Is a transfer of shares by a sanctioned person to family members or associates considered valid under US law? And what should we consider again?
Sure. Nick, you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah. So there's not any kind of specific prohibition under US law of a sanctioned person, Cartes say, divesting himself of assets to a non-sanctioned person, provided that there's no US nexus to the transaction. So there's nothing to stop Cartes from divesting himself of a company that he owns in Grupo Cartes or otherwise to some other Paraguayan national, as long as there's no connection to the US as any part of that transaction. The issue is whether and how OFAC would recognize that's happened. So if you're doing business with a company that was owned by Cartes until recently, and you're completely sure that it's no longer owned by Cartes, and therefore it should not be subject to sanctions itself, OFAC may not necessarily be aware of this. And if they see you doing business with a company that they know was recently owned by Cartes, has connections to Cartes, they may be interested in the transaction anyway, and there may be some secondary sanctions risk there. So there's an issue about whether OFAC would understand that it's happened. And And then again, those 4 companies that were specifically sanctioned themselves, doesn't matter if Cartes or Grupo Cartes divest of those companies, they're sanctioned themselves specifically, and they will continue to be sanctioned unless OFAC delists them. So any kind of divestment there doesn't matter. And then circling back to the point, and as you said, Carlos, this relates to the last question, if they've been divested to a family member or close associate of Cartes or Velázquez, then there's going to be some risk that that person is kind of a straw man and is acting on behalf of the sanctioned person, Cartes say. So if Cartes divests himself, but then continues to pull all of the strings and controls the company through another person, that's probably not going to satisfy OFAC as far as the sanctions are concerned.
As a follow-up to that, so just to give you a little local context, there was an article in a local paper here citing an unnamed source at the U.S. Embassy, and they mentioned fictitious transfers, and that OFAC would be looking into those as a matter of high importance, and they're gonna take a look at that and make sure that the transfers are actually real, and that he actually does relinquish control of these companies. Is there such a thing in U.S. law, fictitious transfer, or is that just kind of a term that was casually mentioned by this supposed U.S. Embassy employee?
Yeah, that it basically is fraud. That's not like a clear legal term, at least not that I'm aware of. It's a common approach for sanctioned parties to take to essentially pretend to give up control when they actually retain it. So it just means that OFAC is going to be looking very closely at all of these transactions to ensure that they really are what the parties say they are. And it goes to, look, I guess to take a step back, OFAC doesn't sanction individuals or companies unless they're absolutely sure that they want to. So they don't want to make mistakes. And I'm not saying they're perfect, but they're very careful about this. So once you're on the list and once you've been sanctioned, it's very hard to come off. And they have the view that these individuals or entities are not to be trusted. So that's the way. I'm okay, thank you. Yeah, so it will be difficult, and they will look at everything they do with suspicion. And so they use that term. It's just one term to go to whether the sanctioned parties are actually doing what they're saying they're doing.
Yeah, and one reason that we might think that OFAC will be extra suspicious here is the fact that they took the step of designating those 4 companies. Because as we've discussed, if those companies are owned 50% or more directly or indirectly by Cartes, then designating Cartes would have the effect of sanctioning those companies as well, even without specifically listing them. The fact that OFAC went out of its way to specifically list these companies individually, even though they would have already been covered by virtue of Cartes being sanctioned, might be evidence that OFAC was suspicious that Cartes would try to divest himself or pretend to divest himself of those companies. And so they took this step to specifically list them so that they cannot be unsanctioned, even if they were allegedly divested. And the fact that they went out of their way to do that is interesting, and we don't always see that. A lot of times when they're trying to target an entire group of businesses and subsidiaries, they would only target the ultimate owner and then let the 50% rule cover everyone else. The fact that they went out of their way to target these 4 companies suggests that they wanted to make sure that those companies were going to continue to be sanctioned no matter what Cartes did or allegedly did.
And just to round off this point, if OFAC was of the opinion that a transfer was not a real transfer, and was and the person that it was transferred to was a straw man, as you said, Nick, what actions would it take? Would it communicate something to the public? Is there a way for us to know that one of these transfers is not considered by OFAC a legitimate one, or that the company that the designated person divested from is still sanctioned?
Unfortunately, probably not. They might say something, but especially if it's a company that wasn't specifically sanctioned itself and is just covered by the 50% rule. As Ken mentioned earlier, it's incumbent on anyone doing business to exercise their own due diligence and make sure they're not dealing with sanctioned persons. And I think in this kind of a scenario, it would be the same. OFAC would expect you to make sure that this company you're dealing with is not actually owned by Cartes indirectly anymore. And they're not necessarily going to announce that they've made a conclusion one way or the other. It's sort of incumbent on anyone doing business to verify that, unfortunately.
Okay, so that's a great segue into our next question. So what is the scope of these sanctions with respect to third parties, right? So is it only for US persons to comply? Do they extend to Paraguayan persons and companies? Who is considered to be a US person under these regulations?
So a US person, for the purposes of these sanctions, is one of three things. US citizens and permanent residents, which generally means green card holders in the US. Anyone in the United States, as Ken said, regardless of their nationality or citizenship, if they're physically in the US, they count as a US person as long as they are there. And then any entities that are organized under US law, including their foreign branches, so branches they might have in Paraguay, but not including separately incorporated subsidiaries. So if an American company has a branch office in Paraguay, that's considered a US person. If they have a Paraguayan incorporated subsidiary, that's not a US person, that's a Paraguayan person. So that's the extent of US persons that are required to comply with the prohibitions on doing business with SDNs. Couple of notes though. For one thing, any Paraguayan business that is a subsidiary of a US company may face greater risk just because of its US parents. Any Paraguayan business that has any kind of US persons involved in its business, right, like employees or agents or representatives, would need to make sure that they're not involved in any kind of dealings with SDNs. And then, as Ken mentioned earlier, there's the risk of secondary sanctions, right? So the executive order under which these sanctions were issued authorizes additional sanctions against anyone who's doing business with any of these SDNs. So a Paraguayan business with no US persons involved, no US nexus in any way, that does business with any of these sanctions targets is at some risk of becoming sanctioned itself and subject to the same restrictions as Cartes and Velázquez and all of these businesses. So even without a US nexus, it's very important to be vigilant here. And then, sorry, just one other point about US nexus is that one of the main ways we see this come up is in dealings that involve US correspondent banks. So especially transactions denominated in US dollars. So that's a particular thing to be on the lookout for.
Can I add a point to that? So the other main way we see this, and we've referenced it a couple of times, is to the extent there are any US investors, any US lenders, you're involved in any joint ventures with American companies or financial institutions, whether there are any multilateral banks such as the IDB or the World Bank or the IFC involved, then really any nexus at all that not a Paraguayan entity or person has with any of these sanctioned companies or entities could create risk, could be an event of default. To the extent you're involved in financings with any Western companies or the multilaterals that I mentioned, they will have broad sanctions language. Now, you may have encountered that because of the impacts on other, South American or Latin American countries, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, but in particular, but you may not have had to deal with this in the same way that many of other clients our other clients have had to. To give you some background on that, for the World Bank and for the IFC and the IDB, as well as for many of our banking clients, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Barclays, Standard Chartered, the whole range of US and Western banks, we've written a lot of their sanctions language. We're very familiar with what's in there and why they look at it and so to the extent you need to think about that, and when you come away from this conference today, one of the things I would look at is your agreements with third parties to see what kinds of sanctions language those agreements have in them.
So I'm looking at our audience, and there's a lot of people from financial institutions here in Paraguay, banks and others here with us today. So just to understand what banks, if I'm the compliance officer for a local bank, what am I looking at first? I need to figure out if I'm considered somehow a U.S. person. So if I'm a locally incorporated company, as all banks in Paraguay are, we're not initially, right? So what if we have U.S. persons as shareholders? Would that affect the calculus?
Very unlikely unless they hold more than 50%. So, you're not likely, it's not likely at all. But you may have agreements with their shareholders where those shareholders have said to you, you can't be dealing with any sanctioned parties. So, you could have liability or at least contractual issues under those agreements. But just to get to your point on whether you're a U.S. person, almost certainly none of you are. The issue would be whether you have U.S. personnel that you'd need to make sure they're excluded from any dealings with sanctions targets. And then, of course, if you're a senior person at the bank and you happen to be negotiating a deal while you're in Miami or New York, you're a U.S. person while you're there. So you need to be extra cautious about that. And there are cases with OFAC and the U.S. government being pretty aggressive on those jurisdictional questions.
Okay, and I think Nick had mentioned the use of U.S. dollars and transactions in U.S. dollars. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, Nick, and how that would maybe increase the scope of the sanctions or the third parties that should comply with the sanctions?
Sure, happy to. This is one of the main ways that we see a U.S. nexus creep into transactions that do not otherwise involve U.S. parties. So typically when, as I'm sure many of the attendees know, when a transaction is denominated in U.S. dollars or U.S. dollars are used as part of the clearing process, a U.S. correspondent bank will be involved in clearing those payments, even if none of the parties were U.S. and none of their actual banks or like bank accounts are held at U.S. banks. And so in that kind of a situation, there might not be an evident U.S. nexus from the parties or their respective banks, but when you go to process a payment in U.S. dollars, a U.S. correspondent bank is involved, and that U.S. correspondent bank is a U.S. person for U.S. sanctions purposes and would be violating U.S. sanctions if it were to process a payment, for example, for or on behalf of any SDN. And that's a problem for a couple of reasons. One being that the U.S. bank may refuse to make that payment. It may block the payment, meaning it sort of seizes it and freezes it and won't return it. It won't process the payment, but it also won't return it to the person trying to make it. So if you tried to make a payment to a Cartes or Bebidas and you used a U.S. correspondent bank, they would seize the payment and not return it to you or process it. But the other issue is that OFAC can and does enforce against non-U.S. persons for causing a violation or attempting to cause a violation of U.S. sanctions. So a non-U.S. person that tries to send a payment to an SDN through a U.S. correspondent bank, even unknowingly, might be viewed as having violated sanctions by OFAC for causing or attempting to cause a violation. And it's important to note that U.S. sanctions operate on a strict liability basis. So even if you didn't know, even if you took all appropriate forms of due diligence, doesn't matter. Now, historically, we've usually viewed U.S. dollars as being a problem because they typically involve U.S. correspondent banks. So if you were to pay an SDN in U.S. dollars with a suitcase of cash and no U.S. correspondent bank or other U.S. person was involved, we would not necessarily have viewed that historically as a violation. That said, there have been a couple of recent OFAC enforcement actions which kind of suggest that OFAC may view the mere presence of US dollars as being sufficient for US jurisdiction. So I would be very, very careful about anything involving US dollars and SDNs, even if you are quite sure that there's no US correspondent bank involved. Generally, you want to be avoiding any kind of US dollar payments to or from or otherwise involving any SDN. Ken, anything to add?
No, I mean, I would triple emphasize what you just said. I mean, that's kind of where the exposure for you all in this room could come. And so you just need to be very cautious about it. And it may seem surprising. I mean, this is part of the daily life of many of our clients. And I think it's now going to become part of the daily life of yours.
No, this is a key issue for Paraguay. Much of our economy is dollarized unofficially.
Yes.
Right. So a lot of the transactions that happen in Paraguay, including real estate, cars, anything you buy that's over a certain value is usually quoted and paid for in US dollars. And we do have local bank transactions in US dollars. We have US dollar accounts here in Paraguay. So this is going to be a key issue for the market here locally. So the fact that you've triple emphasized that we should be very careful about using US dollars with regards to sanctioned persons is a very useful advice. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And what action must companies in Paraguay take immediately to comply with sanctions and the related general licenses? And what level of due diligence must be performed to avoid transactions with sanctioned entities in the future?
Nick, I'll start and then hand to you. So look, the first thing, I guess the most obvious one is have no dealings at all with the SDNs. So the 2 individuals and the 4 companies, unless it's in compliance with the general license and the wind down. And we can talk about that. The whole general license compliance, what does comply, what doesn't, you'll have to look at that very carefully. So that's the first. Don't do any business directly or indirectly with any of these SDNs, right? Secondly, you got to avoid any dealings on their behalf, even indirectly, even if there's no US nexus. So this is a slightly broader than the first, but you want to avoid both the primary and the secondary sanctions, right? So let me take a step back and restate that. The first is no US nexus. So just be careful about who your US folks are. Secondly, any dealings with them, if they're not in compliance with the general license, then don't do any of them. So I suppose the first step is understand what your connections are to these SDNs. Look now, do some due diligence on your holdings, your transactions, your any kind of investment that you're involved in, and understand directly and indirectly who else is involved. And then think about what kind of due diligence and processes you're going to need going forward. The economy is not going to shift out of dollars anytime soon. So you're going to be operating in a higher risk environment now. And so it's important to take careful stock of what you do, where, how, whether you have the right people doing due diligence, whether people are taking it seriously, because the last thing you want is for one of the parties in this room to end up getting sanctioned because you ended up doing business with one of these parties directly or indirectly, and you didn't even realize it until it was too late. And we do see that happening, and you just don't want to get on the back foot on that. So, I mean, I think, again, just to review, look carefully first at your US nexus to any dealings with these SDNs. Secondly, make sure you have nothing that you're doing that directly or indirectly benefits any of them. And then third, related to all those, focus on your due diligence. What are you looking at? Do you have the right people, the right processes? Do you understand who you're dealing with now? And do you have process in place to ensure that the new transactions you enter into now aren't going to get you into trouble?
So if I may, I can just on the comment on a couple of parts of that. And first on the general licenses, as Pamela noted, there's 2 general licenses in effect, which authorize various types of transactions involving these targets. And the first, General License 5, authorizes only certain specific transactions relating to debt or equity or derivatives contracts involving frigorifico Cha-cha. My Spanish isn't great. My Guarani is definitely worse, but hopefully that was at least serviceable. And the second, General License 6, is a more typical wind down license. This is something we see a lot of. OFAC designates certain persons as SDNs and at the same time issues this license, allowing people to kind of unwind their dealings with the SDN over a certain period of time, like a grace period to unwind any transaction so that you're no longer dealing with this target. So General License 6 covers the 4 specifically designated entities, as well as any other entities that are owned 50% or more by Cartes. Note that it does not cover dealings with Cartes himself, nor does it cover Velázquez or any entities that he may own. It's only companies owned directly or indirectly by Cartes. And it basically covers anything you need to do to unwind or wind down transactions involving those businesses until March 27th, and it's 12:01 a.m. on March 27th. So really, it's more like end of the day on March 26th. What exactly is covered by the wind down kind of depends on the circumstances, and it would not cover new business or new relationships with them, and whether or not it's covered kind of depends on the circumstances. But the general idea is it's an opportunity to get out of bed with them prior to the expiry of the wind down. And then just briefly on the diligence point, as I mentioned, U.S. sanctions are strict liability, so there's no level of due diligence that would excuse a violation or sanctionable conduct. It's sort of up to companies to adopt a risk-based approach in terms of how much diligence they want to conduct. But it is important to note that there's never a time where if you do business with an SDN and it was in violation of sanctions because there was some kind of a US nexus, or it was sanctionable conduct that could result in you getting sanctioned yourself, there's never a time where you could say to OFAC, well, we asked them, we conducted some due diligence and we didn't know. We did our best to make sure that we weren't doing this and we didn't know. You can say that, but OFAC may not care. And there's never a time when a certain amount of due diligence is going to get you off the hook, because these sanctions do operate on a strict liability basis.
That's super clear, Nick. Just to follow up, so you mentioned the wind down grace period that's granted under the general licenses. Just in practical terms, for say a bank, what would you see normally this wind down look like? Are we closing bank accounts in US dollars? Are we closing bank accounts in local currency? What are we doing with outstanding loans? How does that normally translate in practice to say a bank?
Yeah. So Nick, I'll start. I mean, certainly it's closing any accounts. To the extent there's an existing loan, then, you're going to try to get payment before or transfer it to someone else. It seems, and that's one of the kind of interesting things in these, some of the wind down, some of these activities would actually seem to counterintuitively benefit the sanctioned party. So we need to think about that as well. But we'd have to really terminate any relationships you have with this person or with this entity within the time period. So again, that goes to understanding the details of each of those relationships, whether it's a loan, whether it's a bond, some kind of ongoing contractual obligation, any kind of payment obligation, et cetera, that you would need to terminate so that they can't rely on it. And this goes down to checking and savings accounts all the way up to kind of more significant loans and other financial relationships. So again, it goes to understanding every relationship you have with these persons or entities, and then trying to find a way to terminate them consistent with the license.
Ken, you mentioned any relationship. Does that include relationships that where there's no exchange of money or funds? For example, marketing alliances?
I mean, anything that's providing, you're probably going to have to wind those down too. I mean, I thought you were going to go to personal relationships, which obviously this doesn't cover, but yeah, any business relationship that provides a benefit to them, one way or another is potentially violative of these rules.
Yeah, if I can read the authorization from Executive Order 13818 that authorizes sanctions against anyone who's doing business with an SDN designated under this regime. It's anyone who is deemed to have materially assisted, sponsored, or provided financial, material, or technological support for, or goods or services to or in support of. So it doesn't have to be money. It could be any kind of service, any kind of benefit going one way or the other. And we typically see OFAC interpret that very broadly. As Ken said, not personal relationships, not things like that, but any kind of like ongoing business relationship of goods, services, funds, anything like that.
Well, just to give you all an example, Microsoft doesn't allow Outlook and Microsoft Office services to be used by any US or non-US company to service, for example, transactions in Cuba or communications, even email. So, and that's because Microsoft would be worried about its own potential liability under sanctions. So, just to give you a sense of how broad this restriction is. So, for the financial institutions in the room, it really goes to any of your business activities that relate to these parties or entities.
Thank you, Kenneth. What are the risks of non-compliance for companies in Paraguay?
Nick, you want to take this first?
Sure. So, I mean, we've sort of covered off some of these points. I think there's very broadly, there's two risks. There's two legal risks, and I guess there's a third, reputational risk. So legally, if there's any dealings with any of these targets that involves a US nexus, even if it's just US dollars or it's something indirect, there's a risk of violation. There's a risk that the Paraguayan company would be viewed as having violated sanctions by causing a US person to violate. And that could lead to OFAC enforcement, which can lead to all kinds of penalties, including potentially very large fines, as well as other kinds of like restrictions on doing business. And then secondly, there's the risk of secondary sanctions. So there's the risk that even if there's no US nexus in any dealings with these SDNs, that OFAC would take action and sanction the Paraguayan company itself, at which point the Paraguayan company in question would be subject to the exact same restrictions that Cartes and Velázquez and all of these companies are now subject to, which is probably even worse than a penalty. And then third is not a legal risk, but it's just reputational. Particularly, especially U.S. banks and companies, but also really companies and financials all over the world are going to be very hesitant to do business with banks or companies in Paraguay that are viewed as having relationships with SDNs. So there can be adverse consequences even aside from the risk of OFAC enforcement or sanctions designations.
To expand on that, to the extent, you have US investors, shareholders, prospective partners, they are now going to be looking at Paraguay in the way they hadn't before. And they'll want to know that their partners in country are not going to get them in trouble. So they're going to want to know that you are completely ring-fenced from any of these sanctioned parties and that you have compliance policies and procedures that work and that will ensure that you're insulated from these issues, and then in turn that they are insulated from these issues. And so you're likely, if you haven't already, to start getting questions from your US investors and partners along these lines, and you'll need to be prepared to respond to those kinds of questions. And you may be asked to provide additional comfort or respond to additional kind of detailed due diligence about your own activities along the lines of what Nick and I have been talking about today, and then being in a position to answer those questions could actually lead to additional information or disclosures about your own activities. So this is a time, as we would say, to get your house in order, make sure you understand exactly what you do, where and how, and deal with it, because the risks here are significant. I think, there's the possibility, as Nick summarized, of enforcement. But the bigger risk is kind of loss of business, loss of trust from your US partners, and loss of future kind of growth as a result of all this. So the key is, as soon as you can become clear and comfortable in stating affirmatively that you're insulated from this, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, this may kind of change the game in terms of how Paraguay is viewed globally from a sanctions risk perspective, which I think Ken mentioned earlier. We do a lot of due diligence for our clients on sanctions risk in transactions and just in general. And a few months ago, I think if I was doing a sanctions due diligence project and a company we were looking at had significant operations in Paraguay, that really wouldn't have raised any concerns. And now, knowing what we know about the Grupo Cartes and its involvement in the Paraguayan economy, there will be an additional focus on this and questions asked. And it's a little bit closer to a situation like you have in some jurisdictions where the whole country isn't sanctioned, but there's a number of companies and businesses that have a lot of involvement in the national economy that are sanctioned, and it just requires an additional level of scrutiny and due diligence. And I think so it may really change the way that Paraguay is perceived from a sanctions risk perspective, which, like Ken said, means that it's important to get your house in order now.
Can I give you an example of that? So, we work on really hundreds and hundreds of transactions each year, M&A, banking, all sorts of, finance, bonds, project finance. And, there's kind of a general playbook on due diligence that, Nick referenced that we follow. And in the sanctions context, there's always a question, does the target or borrower or issuer of securities have any direct or indirect dealings with sanctions targets, which now we know you have a few in Paraguay, right? And then there'll be specific questions about specific jurisdictions. And typically they'll ask or will ask about Iran, Russia, North Korea, Ukraine, Syria, Cuba, Paraguay, sometimes maybe Venezuela, Nicaragua, right? But Paraguay was never part of that. Now it will be. And so that means that seemingly innocuous financings are going to start getting these kinds of questions. You or your clients will start to get these questions, and it's going to now become, something that you're going to need to focus on a more day-to-day basis.
So just in that train of thought, it was quite surprising for us when these sanctions came in, and the time at which they came in, right? So first of all, it was surprising that two such high level and highly visible political figures in Paraguay would be targeted. Secondly, one of them was a sitting vice president, which I'm not sure there's a whole lot of precedent for on a global scale. Let us know if there is, but it's a sitting vice president of an allied and friendly country, right? So it's not, I understand sanctioning Putin at a time of war, but it's very different to sanction a sitting vice president of a friendly country. And lastly, the timing of the sanctions was very noteworthy, right? Both of these designated individuals were in the midst of political campaigns, very high profile political campaigns. So it was surprising for us to see these sanctions and the time at which they came. And also it seems to me at least that it's a slight deviation from the US's traditional position in Paraguay of not meddling politically, right? So they've been very careful about not taking any visible action that would clearly affect the political climate in country. So the fact that they went against that tradition, that historical tradition in this case, do you think it signals a much more aggressive stance from the US government when it comes to things like this, like corruption in Paraguay and in Latin American countries? Should we expect a much more stricter enforcement of these regulations in our countries?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we have, first of all, let me say, Nick and I aren't representatives of the U.S. government, so we're not defending this. And there's always an argument or a view, which is clearly legitimate, that the U.S. this is extraterritorial application of U.S. law, and one could argue that the U.S. should mind its own business. And I understand those, and we could debate those kind of geopolitical issues forever. What the U.S. government is saying is that they continue to look at fighting corruption everywhere, including where our allies are involved. And you could say legitimately, that's pretty ironic given all the problems that the U.S. itself has. And I agree with that. I agree with you if you say that. But what the U.S. government and what OFAC is saying is that they're going at corruption. They've developed proof of corruption here, and they're going to act on it. And that, actually the world economy and the community in Paraguay should be, I don't want to say grateful, but should be in agreement that fighting corruption is good for everybody, and that if we see it, we should fight it. So that's what they're saying. Does it mean that there'll be more focus? I think this administration the Biden administration has said repeatedly that it wants to make corruption everywhere a focus, and it's going to continue to do that. And this is emblematic of that focus. Will it continue? I think there's no indication that necessarily Paraguay is a particular focus. There hadn't been till now, but the fact is that this will now bring a spotlight to Paraguay where there hasn't been one before. And whenever there's a spotlight, you see things that you didn't see before. So on that basis, it would not be surprising to me if other entities or institutions that have connections with these sanctions targets ultimately find themselves under scrutiny. Now, does that mean that they would become sanctioned themselves? No, not necessarily. But as transactions come to light, then OFAC finds out about them. It would not be surprising for additional corporations and financial institutions in Paraguay to receive subpoenas from OFAC and maybe have to start their own internal investigations. And those could come up in the most likely way they come up is where your correspondent US bank, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, discovers or suspects that some of your activities are violative, and then they report them to OFAC because they're obligated to. It's not that they're kind of being a bad, unloyal friend to you, but they're under a legal obligation themselves to disclose anything. And so that is often how it happens. We do a lot of investigations for non-US financial institutions in this position, and that's often how it happens. It's a disclosure either that comes from a correspondent bank in the US, or they've started one investigation, and in that investigation, they get information that relates to another company or bank, and then they raise questions to that second company or bank.
One thing I'd follow up on too, I agree that U.S. focus on anti-corruption in the sanction space has been increasing under the Global Magnitsky program, and we might expect to see that continue, not necessarily specifically for Paraguay, just as a worldwide point. And in fact, Global Magnitsky sanctions have been issued all over the world. I mean, and including in some other sometimes surprising jurisdictions. Paraguay is not alone in that respect. It may be worth noting that last summer, I think last July, the U.S. State Department had designated Cartes and 3 of his adult children as being involved in significant corruption. And so that may have been kind of a precursor to this event. And I would not be shocked if those 3 adult children were to be designated as SDNs at some time in the future, especially if it seems like Cartes is transferring businesses to them. As we discussed earlier, there's always a risk of the family members or straw men being targeted themselves. But in general, it's sort of hard to predict exactly how these things are going to play out. Overall, we do tend to advise our clients that when they're dealing with individuals or entities that have been associated with corruption or even just allegations of corruption, there's going to be some greater risk exposure moving forward. And that's true everywhere in the world.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. So while we've been speaking here, we've been receiving via email some questions from our audience. So we'll jump into those. I'll start with the first one, Pamela, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. How are the bonds affected? I mean, the bonds issued by companies owned by Cartes, where he is or where he was the primary owner, especially if the bonds were issued in US dollars, how they are affected?
Nick, you want to take that first?
Sure. So as long as Cartes is the majority owner of a company, even if it's indirect through multiple intermediate parents, then that company will be an SDN as well, as we've discussed. And so any dealings with or for the benefit of that company would violate sanctions if there's a U.S. nexus, and U.S. dollar denominated bonds would qualify as that. And risk sanctions designation even in the absence of a U.S. nexus. So I think that depending on the exact structure of the bond issuance, this is one where we'd be typically counseling our clients to try to look at trying to execute a wind down or other disentanglement before the expiry of the applicable general license.
And the second question that came from our audience is with respect to infrastructure projects, which one of you mentioned a few minutes ago. How are infrastructure projects that are financed by US based banks or multilateral organizations affected? Especially consider that one of the companies in Grupo Cartes is a very large manufacturer of cement here in Paraguay.
Yeah. So if you look at the documents on those agreements, they almost certainly have strong sanctions language. And so, as I indicated, one of the things, I think it was Pamela's question about what you all should be doing now. You should be looking now at all the language in your agreements where there's any kind of US nexus. And it's possible that you'll have potentially a reporting obligation or even an event of default. I mean, I'll give you an example that we had from earlier this week. We have a Latin American client that is in the midst of a project with a multilateral, and they have Huawei, the Chinese entity, as a supplier. They also had a North American supplier, and that supplier's agreement had a provision that said that the project company can't have any dealings with any sanctions targets. And the way it was written, the language was broad enough to include Huawei. And the way the circumstances developed, that was arguably a breach or violation of the agreement with the Canadian supplier. And if there's a breach of that agreement, you'd also have a breach of the agreement with the IDB. And so even though in that case, which is different than here, it was entirely legal for the project company to have an agreement with Huawei because they're subject to a different kind of sanctions. The fact that that language was in the agreement and it was so broad led to a potential default or at a minimum, a delay in disbursement from the IDB. I mean, which would have been a disaster for this project. And so Guillermo, to come to your point, I mean, folks need to be looking right now at what their agreements say and understanding them. And so if there's a bond, if there's a project financing, and there's any kind of Western bank involved, they will be looking carefully at this. And it could mean finding a different supplier. It could mean ring fencing this party so that it's not involved in any way in the project. And it also will likely mean either waiting for a question from your partners or you proactively approaching your partners and say, let's have a conversation about these sanctions and what we do about it. Because anyone who's paying attention in these projects will know about what's happening here. And in my personal feeling, it's better for you to proactively raise the issue and address it than just wait.
Thank you, Kenneth, Nick. And I have another question. What are the potential implications to local financial institutions that open a banking relationship or continue with their existing relationship with entities that were controlled by the OFAC blocked person at the time of the OFAC order, but that ceased to be held by any such person after the order? Are there any mitigating steps that will be recommended to those financial institutions?
Nick, you want to take this first?
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little earlier, that there's this issue of satisfying OFAC that the sanctioned shareholder is no longer the majority shareholder of a company. So for companies other than the 4 that were specifically named themselves, I think it would probably be important to make sure that the bank or whoever it is has some kind of strong evidence that a divestment has actually occurred, and that the now sanctioned former shareholder is indeed a former shareholder and no longer currently the majority owner, as well as that person is no longer pulling the strings behind the scenes. We talked about a transfer that's not a legitimate transfer, and we've also talked about transfers where it's legitimate in terms of actually transferring the ownership, but then the former shareholder continues to actually control the company, and you'd want to try to take some steps to ensure that that's not happening. Although we appreciate that can be difficult, and unfortunately, as discussed earlier, because OFAC sanctions are strict liability, it is really, there's no level of diligence that will satisfy OFAC if that turns out to not be the case. And then it's important to draw a distinction between the 4 companies that were specifically listed themselves and any other ones. As mentioned earlier, those 4 companies that were specifically listed, it doesn't matter if they're not owned by Cartes anymore. The fact that they were listed themselves mean that they will continue to be sanctioned unless and until OFAC takes them off the list.
Let's see, because there are a couple of more questions. Are there any specific elements that will trigger secondary sanctions to non-US individuals?
Well, as we discussed, it's any kind of an ongoing business relationship or provision of goods or services to or in support of any SDN, including companies that are owned by SDNs, may be satisfactory as far as OFAC is concerned to lead to secondary sanctions. So it's hard to say like what kind of a specific business relationship would trigger secondary sanctions, but in general, any kind of ongoing business relationship, including, as we discussed, where there's no funds involved, it's just, it's some kind of a service or branding or anything like that could potentially lead to secondary sanctions. It's discretionary, so OFAC can it's up to OFAC to decide whether or not to impose secondary sanctions, but if there's any kind of ongoing relationship, OFAC probably could do that if it so chose, and whether it will or not just depends on what the relationship is and how significant it is, and so on.
Right. So just to put a finer point on that, each of you in the room should look at all of your relationships directly or indirectly with these SDNs. And then either on your own or with us or with someone like us, assess them against the rule, right? Are they, even if you have, first question is, do you have a US nexus? Yes or no? And then if no, then the next question is this activity still significant enough to subject you to secondary sanctions? We'd have to look at it one by one. We do that all the time. We have parties all over the world who have some residual relationship with someone who is or has become an SDN. There's a wind down. There are certain obligations or contractual payments that are due or owed one way or the other. Not all of those activities lead to secondary sanctions, but some of them do, and you need to be cautious about it. The other thing I would say is that even if they didn't lead to secondary sanctions per se, they will likely be captured in the due diligence questions that your US bank or investors or shareholders or government counterparties or multilateral counterparties will ask you. So you will likely now start to receive more detailed sanctions questionnaires in various contexts saying, do you have any dealings directly or indirectly with any sanctions targets, including these folks and these companies that we're talking about today? And you're going to need to be in a position to say yes or no, and if yes, what you're doing about them. So while you obviously need to make sure you're not hit with secondary sanctions, I think the more immediate risk is that you have this impacting your contractual relationships.
Ken, Nick, one of the questions we got is, how do you get out of an OFAC sanctions list? Is this just a determination that OFAC will take entirely on its own, or is there something the sanction entities can do or change to get out and get off the sanctions list?
It's very, very difficult. So as I mentioned earlier, OFAC spends a lot of time putting together what it calls designation packages to kind of come to the view that an individual or entity deserves to be sanctioned. And that goes right up to the top of the Treasury Department for approval. It's vetted by a lot of people. So once they've come to that conclusion, then that company or entity needs to take significant steps to demonstrate it has changed, it has come on, and it has taken steps that merit it being removed from the list. It's very, very difficult. So if you have dealings with any of these entities now, and you're thinking, well, we're going to fight and they're going to get them off the list, this is going to be years or decades, not months, right? So the likelihood that OFAC made a significant mistake on this is pretty low. I think they knew what they were doing. So I wouldn't assume, and even if I know that Cortez has been saying that, you know, this is a mistake and, you know, he has no dealings with terrorists and he's going to fight. I'm sure he's saying that. That's what everyone says, but it'll be very difficult, I think, for that to happen. So your expectation should be that these sanctions will be in place for some time and that they're going to be reality to deal with for the foreseeable future.
Usually when people come off a list, if they come off a list, it's because of a change in US foreign policy rather than them challenging the list. So for example, we saw a bunch of Iranian companies come off the list as part of the so-called Iran deal. We saw sanctions relaxed against Libya when the late Muammar Gaddafi started abandoning his anti-American foreign policy. And I think something like that would be more likely to lead to these individuals coming off and companies coming off rather than them challenging the designation. You can protest to OFAC, but it's just not very likely to be fruitful.
And does OFAC ever share its designation process with designated parties? Will they share their arguments? No, it's not a due process kind of thing. I mean, what will likely happen, and we have people approach us from time to time. You know, in fact, we had a very interesting one this week, but I can't tell you about it, where a party on the list comes and says, can you help us get off the list? And, you know, some will have a justifiable reason and some won't. And even where a party feels that injustice has been done, it takes some time. And if you think about it, the individuals at OFAC, just like the individuals at CFIUS, you know, it's a pretty big career move to remove someone from the list. You know, there's also a credibility issue for the US government. So they don't take these decisions lightly, and everyone who has an interest in it within the government will need to sign off. There's also scrutiny that comes from Congress. So there's a lot of external scrutiny on these decisions. So again, I think you should expect again that these sanctions will be in place for some time. Great, thank you. Thank you. One last thing, and this might be the final question, but it's been bugging me and I want to see if we can get a little bit more clarity on this. and it's with respect to the 50% rule and what we mentioned as fictitious transfers. So for companies that are right now designated because of the 50% rule, and where there's a transfer to other parties so that that company is no longer within the scope of the 50% rule, the onus is on market players here locally to do their due diligence and try to figure out if they consider that transfer to be valid and to hold water. Is that the case? So there's really no clarity from OFAC as to when a company stops being sanctioned under the 50% rule.
There really isn't. I mean, one of the things that we have done and that we can sometimes do, and which OFAC will sometimes do, is to provide that clarity informally. So, you know, the parties to a transaction might go into OFAC and say, hey, you know, this has happened now, do you agree? Or the market will just come to a view. So it will depend on the circumstances. But, you know, again, we're just going to have to look at each one. So let's take an example. So let's say Tobaccos, there's a transaction. Well, Tobaccos won't be a good example. Let's say one of the other entities, right? We don't have that list of other companies, but let's say, you know, Guillermo USA Inc., right? Another company that is owned 50% or more by Velasquez. You know, you sell 30% of your holdings to Pamela, right? So now you hold less than 50%. You know, the market would look at that. We might run it. We might say to OFAC, this is what we're doing. I mean, for some parties, we send a letter to OFAC saying we're planning to do this. You know, do you agree? We could do that. But typically I'd prefer that the market just comes to a view. And the reason for that, Guillermo, is that, you know, once you've gone into OFAC, then you're on their radar. And, you know, sometimes it's better, even though they're paying attention to Paraguay. I mean, I don't like asking them a question unless I know the answer to every question they might ask us down the road. So for example, if one of your clients in the room were to go into OFAC and say, hey, we're now planning to do this deal. This company used to be 50% owned by Velasquez and now it's not. Before OFAC does anything, they're going to ask you every question about your own operations. Where do you operate? They're going to want to know who they're dealing with. And unless you're crystal clear and crystal clean, you know, it could lead to more problems than you want. And I'm not saying that means you all have to be perfect, but the fact is, once you're on the radar, you're on the radar, and I prefer just to be less known to them. So Guillermo, I'm sorry I can't give you more clarity, but it really is a situation by situation issue. And the only way through it is for you with your clients and with us or someone else to kind of evaluate each transaction on their own and then come to a view.
Great. And that is something that you guys have been helping clients abroad with that due diligence and that determination of whether they can go ahead and do business with some of these entities whose sanction status is not quite clear?
Every day. Every day. I mean, and it's tricky because, you know, we can't, no one can tell you for sure, but everyone can tell you what the smartest thing is to do. And it's tricky, but yeah, I'd say all over the world, we have financial institution and corporate clients who are dealing with the exact same question. You know, can we proceed with this transaction, with this project, with this loan, with this bond offering? What's our exposure? You know, do we need to talk to OFAC? Can we restructure it so they don't have a problem? Does restructuring it itself evade US law, and does the restructuring itself cause liability? Does a particular activity really qualify as wind down? So we had wind down particularly with the Iran sanctions and then with the Russia sanctions, and there was a lot of question about whether continued activity constituted wind down. We're seeing that, Guillermo. I mean, we're seeing it every day. I could give you hundreds of examples. But again, you have to look at each situation, each particular transaction on its own. And as annoying as that is one of the purposes of these rules. It's to make the entire market, US and non-US, think very carefully and with caution about these rules They want you to be afraid because they want you not to deal with these people. So the broadest impact you can have on these sanctions targets, the better as far as they're concerned. I mean, if OFAC could do it, you know, I suppose they could, but it'd be harder to do. You know, they would sanction any entity that's owned even 1% by a sanction target. It wouldn't be the 50% rule, it'd be the 1% rule. But they don't do that because they're also trying to limit to a degree collateral damage. So they're not trying to sanction all of you guys in the room. They're trying to sanction these 2 people and these 4 entities, right? But the fact is they're okay with some collateral damage. And the trick for you all in the room and for us together is to try to limit that as much as possible.
Great. Well, thank you, Ken. Thank you, Nick, so much for sharing your time, your knowledge and your experience with us. I think this has been extremely useful. There's still obviously lots of questions out there about these sanctions. If anyone here is interested in talking to Ken and Nick later, we can share their contact information with you. As you've seen, they have a ton of experience in this area. So I think they would be great advisors under US law for these issues. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Nick, for participating. And I'm sure we'll be in touch again about some of these issues that we've raised here today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much. And maybe we could do it in person in your offices. So let's talk about that after this.
Anytime. You're more than welcome.
Okay. Okay. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you,
Okay.
Nick.
Bye-bye.
Bueno, con esto cerramos el conversatorio de hoy. Esperamos que haya sido de utilidad, que hayamos abordado las preguntas y las dudas que muchos de ustedes tenían, que nosotros también teníamos. Así que, bueno, de parte de Carly, de Pame, mía y de todo Ferrere, muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy y estamos a disposición y a la espera de sus preguntas adicionales o cualquier cosa con la que le podamos ayudar. Gracias.
Gracias.